Gnosticism is the most enduring heresy in the history of the church. We fight it in almost every generation. It's a very, very stubborn heresy. Irenaeus fought this heroic Gettysburg-like battle against it in the 2nd century, and his book remains a sort of monument of how to deal with this problem.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the Senior Publishing Director. Pope Francis has just announced he's planning to declare a new doctor of the church. His name is Saint Irenaeus. Who was he? What were his key ideas? Why does he still matter? That's what we're going to be discussing today with Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon. Always a joy to see you. How are your kids doing there in Florida?
We're doing well.
All flourishing?
I can't remember if I told you recently, but we got a new cow. That's our newest animal here at Burrowshire, a little homestead. We've got goats, pigs, chickens, bees, and now a cow. So I feel like we finally landed as farmers.
Yeah, well, maybe your kids will all grow up to be farmers.
That would be delightful. Listen, at Word on Fire, yet another episode means yet another new book. In this case, 3 new books we just released since our last new episode. They're new editions of books that you've published in the past over the years. I want to show them on camera because they're so gorgeous. This one is titled The Strangest Way. And then we have Proclaiming the Power of Christ. It's a collection of homilies previously titled Word on Fire. And then we have And Now I See. And as you can see, if you're watching the video version, gorgeous, stunning covers, all hardcover editions, beautifully produced. Bishop, say something briefly about these 3 books.
Yeah, well, first of all, as you say, we bought the rights back from the original publishers, and we brought them out in these editions, which really are beautiful. And kudos to our design team, our creative team, just marvelous. I wrote those a long time ago, so Now I See is probably late 90s. Strangest Ways probably in the early zeros. It came out maybe in 2002. Very fond of both those books. I was very much in a kind of literary frame of mind when I wrote those because they all have lengthy sections where I talk about Dante, William Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, all kinds of other people. So I was trying to bring together theology, philosophy, literature, culture in the sort of farrago or amalgam. The Strangest Way, I was very much reading a lot of the post-liberals and postmoderns, and people like Stanley Hauerwas were very influential when I wrote that book. That came to fuller academic expression a few years after that in The Priority of Christ. But in some ways, The Strangest Way was a warm-up for that. And Now I See, I think of that as a summary of a lot of what I was thinking in the wake of my doctoral studies. I just begun teaching, and it's what was on my mind then. The other book of sermons is a collection, as you say, of sermons from many years ago that I delivered, I think, for radio and for the internet and all that. And then we wrote those up as more formal presentations. So you get a little bit of my sense of what a homily is or ought to be. And what I argue in the preface, as I remember, is it's so different from the way I was trained to preach. So my generation was trained to preach in a certain way. What I discovered was almost nobody in the great tradition preached that way. Almost no one, from the earliest days all the way through, John Henry Newman. No one preached the way we were taught to preach, and I thought there was a problem there. And I wanted to show with these sermons, I think, a better way to do it.
So you can get all 3 books in the Word on Fire bookstore. I'll have a link below this video, but it's just bookstore.wordonfire.org. And I think we're running a special right now where you can get all 3 of these books at a huge discount bundled together. So be on the lookout for that. All right, Bishop, let's turn to the great Saint Irenaeus. As I mentioned, Pope Francis just announced informally, I think it was part of another event, he kind of just let it slip that he's planning to formally declare Saint Irenaeus to be a doctor of the church. So I thought we'd kick around the significance of that announcement and then look at some of Irenaeus' key ideas and impact. So let's start with the basics. Who was Irenaeus? When and where did he live? What's he best remembered for?
A great figure, one of my favorite of the church fathers. It's interesting, Brandon, you mentioned the announcement from the Pope. As I remember now, this is before COVID, the U.S. Bishops' Conference discussed the matter because I think it was the French Bishops' Conference had proposed Irenaeus as doctor of the church, and they wanted to get a read from the other bishops' conferences around the world. So it was Cardinal DiNardo was the president at the time, and he's a great patristic scholar. And when he announced it to us, he said what a lot of us felt. He said, I don't know, I always thought he already was a doctor of the church because a lot of us are great affection for Irenaeus. So there was an enormous response of like, well, yeah, of course he should be a doctor of the church. So that consultation process must have gone on until the Pope finally said, okay, I'll make the declaration. So very happy about it. To your question, Irenaeus, he's a figure from the 2nd century, a very early figure. He's born, we're guessing around 130. We don't know exactly. He died, we're a little more exact here, right around the year 200. Irenaeus was born in the East. So he's born in what today is called Izmir. It was called Smyrna back in the day. You might remember St. Polycarp, a famous martyr, was the bishop of Smyrna. And Irenaeus proudly says over and over again in his writings, I was taught by Polycarp, who was taught by John the Evangelist. John the Evangelist had evangelized and trained Polycarp, who in turn influenced Irenaeus. So he's from that part of the Christian world where it began in the East. Then he makes his way, we don't know entirely why, we're not real clear, first to Rome and then north to what's present-day France. And it was called Lugdunum in those days. It was a Roman sort of colonial town. It's now called Lyon. So Lugdunum has evolved into the French word Lyon. So he's called Irenaeus of Lyon today. But there he established himself and engaged in one of the great intellectual projects in the whole Christian tradition. You think of, if you like, the 5 or 6 greatest works of systematic theology, and you'd mention, the City of God of Augustine, you'd mention the Summa of Aquinas, you'd come up through, Karl Barth and people like that in the 20th century. But one of the really earliest and greatest of these systematic presentations of the Christian faith is the Adversus Haereses of Irenaeus. That just means against the heresies, right? What were the heresies of that time? Well, they can be gathered under this sort of great global term of Gnosticism. So that's the way to name the central project of Irenaeus, was to present the biblical view of life over and against a Gnosticizing interpretation of Christianity. And, he's a bit there like Athanasius. Now, Athanasius, you're going to go a century and a half after Irenaeus. But as Athanasius fought the Arians, right, in the 4th century, and that was seen as like a Gettysburg moment. It was a standing or falling battle. If we had lost the battle with the Arians, we wouldn't be Christianity. Well, I think in a very similar way, go back now a century and a half, Irenaeus against the Gnostikoi, as he called them, the Gnostics. If we had lost that battle, we would have devolved into one more kind of boring, vague mysticism. So he's that kind of a pivotal figure. The battles he fought in the 2nd century determine the nature of Christianity in many ways and resonate very much to the present day. Now, he was martyred, we're pretty sure. We don't know absolutely for sure, but likely martyred. He becomes the Bishop of Lyon and then is martyred around the year 200. So not only is he a great intellectual figure, he's a heroic figure as well. So, Irenaeus, delighted he's being named a doctor of the church because he has a lot to teach us. A doctor is just a teacher of the church, right? And he still has a lot to teach us today.
I like how the French bishops asked the other bishops, do you think Irenaeus should be doctor of the church? Because it's hard to imagine a conference of bishops all voting, saying, no.
I don't think so.
No.
Yeah. No, we were like, duh. I mean, I thought he already was. That was our reaction.
Tell us a little bit more about what a doctor of the church is. I think we're up to, 34, 35, something like
5 or 6, yeah.
Okay, so these are like special saints, special teachers, but what makes someone a doctor?
I think it's someone who teaches the faith in such a rich and compelling way that the whole church could benefit from listening to him or to her. So there are teachers, up and down the centuries. Every priest, every bishop is a teacher of the church. But there are certain doctores, teachers, that are so penetrating and so incisive and so maybe encyclopedic or so rich that the whole church should sit up and listen. So, think Augustine and Chrysostom and Aquinas and Jerome and, coming up to the present day, Thérèse of Lisieux, named a doctor of the church. I would hope Newman someday will be doctor of the church. These people that are of such key importance and incisive insight that the whole church should listen to them. That's a doctor of the church.
Tell us a little bit about your personal experience with Irenaeus. I know he's been meaningful to you
Yeah.
for a long time, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you've started writing a whole book on him. I think we have the manuscript half
Yeah.
finished somewhere in our archives, but tell us about your personal
Yeah.
experience with him.
It probably would have started, I'm guessing now, with Sister Agnes Cunningham. Sister Agnes, who's still with us, she's in her mid-90s now. She taught patristics at Mundelein Seminary. And Agnes is a very interesting player. She was the first female president of the Catholic Theological Society of America back in the 1970s. A leading patristic scholar. She was the first woman to get a doctorate from the Institut Catholique in Lyon, which is, of course, where Irenaeus, not the Institut Catholique, but Lyon. Anyway, so Sister Agnes taught patristics when I was a student at Mundelein. As I remember, there was a project in our first year of theology where we had to take a father and do some research and write a paper. And she, I think, had given a lecture on Irenaeus that I thought was really interesting. And so I pursued that with her and said, tell me more and tell me what I should read. And that was the beginning of my experience with him. But I found, he's like a handful of other people in my own life, Aquinas most obviously, but a few others, who are touchstone figures. That Newman's another one too, that I would just go back to a lot and say, yeah, he was right about this, and yeah, he was right about that. And boy, Irenaeus was so insightful. So in the course of my own studies and research and writing, he became a touchstone figure for me and remains that to this day. And you're right about the book. It was our good friend Matthew Levering. I kind of forget now, Brandon, this is years ago, but he was editing a series of books. I'm not sure really what happened to that series, but he invited me to write one on Irenaeus, and I made pretty good progress. I think I had about 30 or 40,000 words written of that book. And then, you know what it was? Then they told me, this was the Brazos Publishing, that they wanted me to work on the 2 Samuel book for their Bible series. And I said, well, now, which one do you want first? Do you want Samuel or do you want Irenaeus? And they said, Samuel. So then I focused on that book and then became rector of the seminary, then became a bishop. And so the Irenaeus project was kind of, lost.
Maybe time to bring it back now that we have Doctor of the Church Irenaeus. We'll see.
Yeah.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to some of Irenaeus's key ideas and contributions. You hinted at maybe the main focus of his life earlier in this discussion when you said he focused on battling Gnosticism, including, when we say Gnosticism, we often think of just pagans who were Gnostic, but including a lot of Christians who were bending in a Gnostic direction. What was Irenaeus's approach to Gnosticism? How did he battle against it?
He was a man of the Bible. I think like a distinguishing feature between, let's say, Origen of Alexandria and Irenaeus. Origen used the philosophical tradition in a big way. Now, Origen was a Bible man too, don't get me wrong. He knew the Bible extremely well. But his project was that of, in some ways, Augustine and Aquinas too, to link together revelation with a dominant philosophical system. In their case, Platonism and Middle Platonism, Thomas's case, Aristotelianism. I'd say with Irenaeus, though, he's not playing that game at all. He's not trying to reconcile Christianity with a philosophy. He's coming consistently out of the biblical vision of things. And he saw the Gnostic vision as deeply unbiblical. Now, I'm going to kind of cut to the chase here. We could talk for, months about Gnosticism. Under that term, it's a kind of a farrago of ideas. But put it this way. It's an extreme prejudice in favor of the spiritual over the material. Brandon, one way to get at this, it's a perennial problem. We human beings are hybrids, right? We're hybrids of the spiritual and the physical. And a lot of the poetry of being human follows from that fact, because there's like this built-in tension between the spirit and the body. And think of a lot of the drama, poetry, and art of human life is generated from that conflict. So there's always a temptation to resolve it on one side or the other, right? To say, no, I'm all body, I'm all matter. Now that looks morally like something, like I just give myself over to the goods of the body. It also can look like something theoretical, that it's all just materialism. It's a reduction to matter, right? The spirit is just an epiphenomenon or it's an illusion. That's more of a temptation today. But the other temptation, it goes right back to Plato, and you see it in the Gnostics, you see it in all forms of Puritanism, is to say, no, I'm all spirit. I'm all spirit, and matter is something kind of grubby and bad and fallen, right? And at the limit, even illusory. It doesn't even really exist. So those two tensions, I'm all spirit, I'm all matter. Irenaeus, it seems to me, had the biblical sanity, this wonderful balance. Of course he knew about the spiritual dimension and aspiration of the human being, but here's the word that I think it's like a refrain that echoes all through Irenaeus' writings: the body, the body, the body, the body. Because the creator God of the Old Testament makes the embodied world. He makes the material world. On the Gnostic reading, that God is a fallen God, a compromised God, who indeed has made this grubby world of matter, but that's a fallen God and an even more fallen world. And the idea that the Gnostikoi have, the knowers, right, those who really get it, is I need to escape from that realm. I have a little light of spirit within me that has to be let loose, escape from matter. Well, see, Irenaeus said, no, that's completely repugnant to the Old Testament perspective. Moreover, God in the New Testament becomes flesh, enters into our flesh, the incarnation, right? So both Old Testament and New militate against, he knew, a Gnosticizing reading of reality. And so, adversus heresis, I'm against these heretical positions. Here's something too, Brandon, really interesting. Boy, it haunts us to this day. A suspicion of the Old Testament. Well, the Gnostics had that in spades because the Old Testament, fallen God, fallen world. Yahweh of the Old Testament with all this thundering legalism and anger, that's typical of this compromised fallen figure. Irenaeus said, no, there aren't the two gods, a fallen one and a true one. God is God. And we have to come to terms with both the Old Testament and New, and in fact, we won't get the New without the Old. Well, that's Irenaeus. That's his anti-Marcionite stance, right? Marcion being an early figure who took up that position, that the Old Testament is no good. Irenaeus said no. And so those moves are of extreme importance in the evolution of Christianity away from a world-denying or matter-denying hyper-spiritualized system. He kept insisting on flesh, the body, matter matters, right? And we could talk about this, but that's why it's of enormous importance to this day.
You've written before that maybe the master idea in all of Irenaeus' theology is that God has no need of anything outside himself. In fact, you've put it pithily, God doesn't need us, and that's good news, you say.
Absolutely.
What does this mean, and why is it good news?
It's so good. You know who mediated that to me would have been Robert Sokolowski years ago, and he put it probably in terms of Anselm, but the idea really goes back to Irenaeus, very old idea, and he repeats it over and over again. You see, if I need somebody, well, then that person is going to meet some want that I have. So I'm in a position now to use that person because I need something that you can give me. That means I'm likely to manipulate you. I can will your good, but there's always going to be a bit of, I will your good for my own sake because I need something from you, right? God is God. He's the creator of the whole universe. The universe can't possibly give him something he doesn't have because he gave everything to the universe, right? That means that God can truly love. He doesn't need the world. The world's not going to add something to him. He's not playing a game of indirect egotism. But God can love in an utterly generous way. And that's why, as I've said, the fact that God doesn't need us is exceptionally good news. That means that we can really enter into an utterly loving friendship with God. And now press it. When I get that divine way of being into me, and we call that grace, right? When God gives me a share in his own life, now I can love in that disinterested way. Even though as a creature, heck, I need all sorts of things. I'm not God, but yet through grace, I can share in the divine life. Now we have saints. Saints are those who can love in this totally disinterested way because they're loving with the very love of God. All of that is really plain. It's really clear in Irenaeus' mind.
I think for most Catholics, the name Irenaeus calls to mind his famous line that the glory of God is man fully alive. You've cited this line very often. What does this mean?
Well, it follows directly from what I just said, right? So Gloria Dei Homo Vivens. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. If God needed us in some way, well then his glory would be, no, if I can take advantage of you, I can get something from you for my own benefit. God would be glorified in the measure that we're kind of put down or used as his servants. You want to see this in action? Look at all the ancient myths that Irenaeus would have known very well in his world, right? The Greek and Roman myths are full of divine figures who need adulation, they need something from the world, and they end up manipulating the world and dominating the world. Their glory is that we be put down. Look at the myth of Prometheus, right? As Prometheus tries to steal fire from the gods, well, the gods are outraged, and they perpetually punish this usurper. Well, sure, that's the way a needy, self-absorbed divinity is going to act. But the true God in the world, he wants to give us. What did Jesus say? I've come that you might have life and have it to the full. I want to give you everything. Well, that God's glory, therefore, is a human being fully alive. That when I'm on fire with God's life, God's glorified by that. He's not competing with it, That's the language of grace. And I've called that the non-competitive transcendence of God. God transcends the world, yes, indeed, but in such a way that he's not competing with the world. I've used the image, and this, is very Irenaean, of the burning bush. As God gets close to his creation, he lights it on fire and makes it more beautiful, and he doesn't consume it. So the bush is not consumed, it's more fully itself. That's an Irenaean idea that has huge implications for the moral life and the spiritual life.
As you said earlier, Irenaeus wrote systematically about almost every aspect of the Christian faith, including salvation. And another of his master ideas, if we can use a little bit of jargon, is the recapitulation theory of atonement. So, this is found a little bit in St. Paul, then in Justin Martyr, but Irenaeus gives it its first full expression. What does Irenaeus mean by recapitulation?
Yeah, his word in the Greek is anakephalaiosis. Kephale in Greek means head, and so head gets translated as caput in Latin. So anakephalaiosis becomes recapitulatio in Latin, hence our recapitulation. What it means, and you're right, it's borrowed from Paul, especially in Ephesians, that Christ becomes the head under which all of creation is gathered. In that sense, he recapitulates all of time and space and history and humanity. All of it comes together in him. That great Pauline image of Christ come to full stature, right? Well, Irenaeus loved that idea and then rang the changes on it. You're right, Brandon, in putting your finger on this age-old problem in theology of, why did the incarnation happen? And there's a kind of reparative theory, it's identified often with Thomas Aquinas, that God became human, that he might save us from our sin, he might repair a fallen world. Well, true, obviously, that's obviously right. But there's also this view, call it recapitulative, that even if we hadn't sinned, even if we had never sinned, the incarnation still would have happened. Why? Because it's the means by which God was going to recapitulate or draw together all creation under the headship of the Son. Now, that's associated later on with John Duns Scotus, and hence you've got a Thomist versus a Scotist view of salvation. But you're right that in some ways the roots of the Scotist view go all the way back to Irenaeus, who was deeply indebted to Paul here. It's a beautiful idea. It's a hopeful idea. It's God's desire for his creation, that nothing be lost, that God will gather all things together under the headship of Christ. It's a more lyrical sort of cosmic understanding of the incarnation and the cross. See, the danger, I suppose, of a purely reparative idea is it becomes very much focused on us and on us fallen human beings, where the recapitulative idea is cosmic in scope, and it speaks of what God wants and desires for his whole creation. And it's a beautiful, lyrical, optimistic construal.
We mentioned at the outset how the context of this announcement that Pope Francis will be declaring Saint Irenaeus to be a doctor of the church was he was speaking to an ecumenical group of Catholic and Orthodox theologians. And he said this, I'm quoting Pope Francis, "Your
Yeah.
patron, Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, whom I soon will be declaring a doctor of the church, with the title Doctor Unitatis, Doctor of Unity, came from the East, exercised his episcopal ministry in the West, and was a great spiritual and theological bridge between Eastern and Western Christians." Say something about this idea of Irenaeus as a bridge figure.
It's a very important idea, and he's right, first of all, in the kind of geographical sense, that literally he moved from the East to the West, and so he's a bridge in his own person. He carries a more Eastern style of thinking into the West. See, keep in mind now, this is a very interesting and long historical problem. The definitive break between the East and the West is in 1054, so long after the time of Irenaeus. But prior to that split, you can see certain differences in theological style and emphasis. For example, in Trinitarian theology, the East tends to emphasize the distinction of the persons. The West tends to emphasize the unity of God. Now, each says the other as well, but there's a kind of style, of theologizing. What do we see now in Irenaeus? And I think here in contradistinction to Augustine, again, whom I reverence. Anyone that's ever followed me or read books of mine, I reverence St. Augustine. But I think Irenaeus is an important corrective. And here's what I mean. There is a kind of pessimism about Augustine when it comes to human nature and the fall. He has the famous theory, I'd say kind of infamous theory, of the massa damnata, that the overwhelming majority of human beings are damned and only a tiny handful through God's inscrutable grace are called from the massa damnata into salvation. In Augustine, a great stress on original sin and the kind of dire consequences of it. Irenaeus, I think it's fair to say, and it's a more Eastern style of thinking, has a more optimistic anthropology, less of a focus on the kind of awfully dire consequences of original sin. With anacephaliosis, I think a more optimistic sense of the possibilities of salvation. Now think of people like Gregory of Nyssa, think of Maximus the Confessor, Eastern figures, who tend in a somewhat more universalizing direction in regard to the question of salvation. The Augustinian tradition tends in a more, kind of darker, more dire understanding of that. That's why I think it's important that Irenaeus, having journeyed literally from east to west, is in a way a certain injection of Eastern thinking into the Western context. And that's all to the good, I think. I quite agree with the Pope there that he's theologically a bridge. And the West can benefit from that certain injection of a more Eastern perspective. Again, it's not to say, boy, the East has got it all together and the West is all. No, not at all. Look, I'm an Aquinas man, and so I love the Western tradition. But I think, as John Paul II said, we want to breathe with both lungs, both East and West. And Irenaeus, I think, helps that process.
Let's close with this final question about Irenaeus's relevance today. I discovered this fact while preparing this episode, that the Second Vatican Council cited Irenaeus 14 times, which makes him the second most cited church father after only Augustine, whom you just mentioned, this connection between Augustine and Irenaeus. So clearly the council fathers believed that Irenaeus had something to say to the church in the modern world. What do you think? Why is Irenaeus still relevant today? What can he speak to us today?
First of all, Brandon, I was grateful for that. I didn't know that he was the second most cited father. It doesn't surprise me really, because think of the influence of de Lubac and Danielu and the Ressourcement movement, and there was such a renewed interest in the fathers, and especially in the Greek fathers, Origen, Irenaeus, and Gregory, and those people. So it doesn't really surprise me. A lot of the fathers of Vatican II and the theologians behind them would have been very open to Irenaeus. Now, why is he relevant today? Well, there's all kinds of reasons, but I'll say this. Gnosticism is the most enduring heresy in the history of the church. We fight it in almost every generation. It's a very, very stubborn heresy. Irenaeus fought this heroic Gettysburg-like battle against it in the 2nd century. And his book remains a sort of monument of how to deal with this problem. Now, where do we see it today? I think in all kinds of ways, but let me give you one indication. Whenever people say things like, the real me, that's my will, it's my interiority, it's my freedom, my decision. And my body, well, yeah, I don't like my body, and so I'm going to change it. I don't like my identity, so I'm going to maneuver things differently. I don't like my gender, I'm going to change it. Well, that's a Gnostic intuition. That says the real me is this kind of spiritual power that lurks somewhere inside the body or alongside of it. And the body is simply malleable matter, which is there for the good pleasure of the spiritual power. That's right out of the Gnostic playbook in terms of anthropology. You can trace it back, as I would, to the founders of a lot of modern philosophy. Look at Descartes' cogito. Look at Kant's privileging of the will in matters of ethics. In all sorts of ways. Look at Hegel's apatheosizing of the ego. Those are all finely Gnostic moves. They've borne, in my judgment, bitter fruit today in ways I've been describing. Whom do we need? We need Irenaeus. We need a new Irenaeus. It's cool, Brandon, just as John Henry Newman, 19th century, said, we need a new Athanasius. He felt we needed and of course, and he sort of claimed the mantle of the new Athanasius. We do need a new Irenaeus today because those Horaces are still around, and we need his eloquent voice to speak against them.
Well, it's time now for our listener question. Every episode, we like to have a question from one of our listeners that Bishop Barron answers here on the air. So if you have a question, send it in to us at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today, we're hearing from Nick in Colorado. He has a skeptical friend, and he's hoping Bishop Barron can help him respond. Here's his question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Nick, and I'm from Colorado. I have a friend who claims that nothing really exists because we can't prove that it exists. What is the Catholic philosopher's response to this worldview? Thanks.
Well, I just badmouthed Descartes a little bit, but let me claim him. Or even go back behind Descartes to Augustine, because Descartes' famous cogito, right? Cogito ergo sum. So in the face of the most withering skepticism, that I'm skeptical about everything because it could be an illusion, it could be a dream, etc. What's the one thing I can't doubt? That I'm doubting. You could say dubito ergo sum. I doubt, therefore I am. At the very least, the doubting subject has to exist. Otherwise, the doubt wouldn't be possible. Well, the roots of that, as I suggest, are Augustinian, because he said in his Latin, si fallor sum. If I make a mistake, well, at least I am. Right? So the skeptic says, look, I'm mistaken about everything. Well, si fallor sum. If I'm mistaken, at least I'm there as a subject of this mistaken judgment. The point is, you can't finally engage in an utterly destructive skepticism, because the very act of being skeptical grounds you in something like reality, right? Now, once you see that truth is kind of self-evidently known, I think it'll follow by certain steps that other truths are self-evidently known. Now, I'm with Newman on this. Newman said, look, most of life, it's true, is known not with certitude, but with probability. And that's true. Is Brandon really in Orlando? Well, I don't know that. This could be, maybe he's next door and they're just sending this image on the screen, Do I think that's true? Well, absolutely not. I think it's extremely probable that Brandon, in fact, is in Orlando, and I'm talking to him by means of this camera. Sure, we can play that game, that certain things are known with an apodictic certitude. Otherwise, the project would fall apart. And then I think most things indeed are known to varying degrees of probability, but we shouldn't let that cripple us psychologically.
Well, as we wrap up here, I'd like to remind you once again to get your copies of the new editions of Bishop Barron's 3 best-selling books. Again, The Strangest Way, Proclaiming the Power of Christ, and then and Now I See. Again, gorgeously designed hardcover volumes. You can pick them up at the website bookstore.wordonfire.org. I will also include a link in the show notes. Well, thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel.